The Columbia River was always a dangerous place to get a drink, but Coyote, the great trickster, thought he was smarter than the water itself. One hot afternoon, Coyote was gulping down water when he felt a strange, icy lump slide down his throat. He had been tricked. A legendary river monster, disguised as a tiny pebble, had just forced Coyote to swallow it whole. Instantly, the monster started growing inside Coyote's belly. It made him impossibly thirsty. Coyote drank an entire stream, then a pond, and then a whole lake, but the monster just soaked it all up and grew heavier. Coyote knew he was gonna burst. He couldn't fight a monster from the inside, so he had to trick it into coming out. Coyote dragged his heavy, sloshing belly into the middle of the scorching desert, far away from any water. Coyote started laughing out loud, shouting to the empty sky, "Oh, I am so glad this monster is stuck inside me. If it came out here, the hot sun would turn it into dry dust in seconds." The monster, hearing this and fearing the dry heat, panicked. It violently wriggled back up Coyote's throat and leaped out onto the sand, expecting to escape. But Coyote was ready. He instantly kicked dry dirt over the monster, trapping it in the desert, where it shrank back into a harmless, dry stone. Coyote walked away, much lighter, and decided he would be a lot more careful about where he drank his water. The trickster survived the river, but the frontier is full of wild, untamed legends. Next time, we ride with Pecos Bill, the only cowboy crazy enough to use a live rattlesnake as a lasso. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Every town has its own tall tales. What's the wildest piece of folklore from your neck of the woods? Tell us the story down in the comments. The deserts of Texas were tough, but nothing was tougher than Pecos Bill. Raised by coyotes and fueled by hot chili, Bill was the greatest cowboy the frontier had ever seen. He didn't ride a normal horse. He rode a wild, massive Mustang named Widowmaker. And instead of a regular rope, he used a live rattlesnake as a lasso. One scorching summer, a drought hit the land so hard the rivers turned to dust. Just when things couldn't get worse, a massive, mile-wide tornado touched down. This wasn't a normal storm. It was tearing up the landscape, swallowing entire canyons, and threatening to wipe out everything Bill loved. Pecos Bill didn't run for cover. He grabbed his rattlesnake lasso, hopped on to Widowmaker, and charged straight at the twisting monster of wind and dirt. As the tornado roared closer, spinning fast enough to rip the earth apart, Bill swung his lasso. With a mighty throw, the snake looped right around the neck of the funnel cloud. Bill yanked it tight, leaping off his horse and directly onto the back of the violent storm. The tornado whipped and bucked like a wild bronco, trying to throw him off into the sky. It dragged him across 3 states, tearing up mountains and carving out valleys as it spun. But Bill held on tight, digging his cowboy boots into the swirling wind. He rode that tornado until it simply ran out of breath, fading away into a gentle rain that watered the entire drought-stricken state of Texas. Pecos Bill landed softly on the muddy ground, dusted off his hat, and walked away, leaving the land saved and soaked. Every town has its own tall tales. What's the wildest piece of folklore from your neck of the woods? Tell us the story down in the comments. Davy Crockett was the undisputed king of the wild frontier, known across the land for his coonskin cap, his fearless attitude, and a smile so charismatic it was said it could melt a block of ice at 50 paces. One freezing winter morning, deep in the treacherous Smoky Mountains, Davy found himself in a serious bind. He had wandered far from his camp and accidentally left his trusty rifle, Old Betsy, leaning against a tree miles away. Suddenly, the bushes parted. Stepping onto the snowy path was the biggest, meanest grizzly bear in all of Tennessee. The massive beast reared up on its hind legs, blocking out the winter sun, and let out a roar that shook the pine needles off the trees. It was ready to strike. But Davy didn't run, and he didn't flinch. Instead, he planted his boots deep in the snow, locked eyes with the towering predator, and just started to grin. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a wild, intense, unblinking frontier grin. He poured every ounce of his legendary pioneer charm and sheer willpower into that one stare. The bear stopped dead in its tracks, completely confused. Davy just grinned harder. The forest went dead silent. Slowly, a bead of sweat rolled down the grizzly's furry face. The giant bear's knees actually began to knock together. The pressure of Davy's unyielding stare was too much. Finally, the alpha predator let out a tiny nervous whimper, dropped to all fours, and scrambled backward into the bushes, completely defeated by nothing but a smile. Davy tipped his coonskin cap to the empty woods, chuckled, and kept on walking. The Wild West is full of characters who bend the rules of reality. Who is the most unbelievable legend from your neck of the woods? Drop their story down in the comments.
Alfred Bulltop Stormalong was the greatest sea captain to ever sail the Atlantic. A man so incredibly massive, he used a fully grown whalebone as a toothpick. His legendary ship, the Courser, was so gigantic that its masts scraped the clouds, and the crew actually had to ride horses on the deck just to get from the bow to the stern. But even a ship that big was no match for the ultimate terror of the deep. One violently stormy night, while sailing through treacherous, uncharted waters, the ocean began to boil. A monstrous, pitch-black kraken with tentacles as thick as redwood trees erupted from the crashing waves and wrapped itself around the Courser's hull. The thick oak groaned, and the massive ship began to tilt. The crew panicked, but Captain Stormalong didn't even blink. He dropped his heavy captain's coat on the deck and dove headfirst into the raging, icy black water. He swam straight at the beast, wrapping his massive arms around its slippery, giant head. For 3 days and 3 nights, the giant captain and the monster wrestled beneath the crashing waves, churning the ocean into a massive whirlpool. Finally, using his unmatched strength, Stormalong managed to tie all 8 of the monster's heavy tentacles into an enormous, impossibly tight sailor's knot. The embarrassed, hopelessly tangled kraken sank back into the abyss, and Stormalong climbed back aboard his ship, soaking wet but victorious. The oceans and frontiers are full of massive legends. Who is the most heroic myth from your coastal town or home state? Let us know their story down in the comments.
Deep in the quiet town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the night sky held a terrifying secret. In the chilly winter of 1966, folks started seeing something impossible lurking near the abandoned TNT plant just outside of town. It wasn't a bird, and it certainly wasn't a man. It was a towering gray creature standing nearly 7 feet tall, with massive bat-like wings that folded against its back. But the most chilling part wasn't its size, it was its eyes. 2 massive glowing red orbs pierced through the darkness like hypnotic headlights, instilling a sense of absolute dread in anyone who locked eyes with them. One night, a couple of teenagers were driving down a dark dirt road when those glowing red eyes suddenly appeared in the beam of their headlights. The massive beast unfolded its wings and launched into the air. Terrified, the driver slammed on the gas, racing their car up to 100 miles an hour, but the creature effortlessly kept pace, gliding silently right above their roof without ever flapping its wings. For over a year, the Mothman stalked the skies of Point Pleasant, appearing like a dark omen right before disasters and leaving a trail of mystery that has never been solved to this day. Does your hometown have a mysterious creature that stalks the night? Tell us the scariest local cryptid from your area down in the comments. Deep inside the pitch-black heart of Big Bend Mountain, a towering man swings a glowing, heavy sledgehammer against solid rock, striking with such explosive force that meteors of sparks fly into the dark, racing neck and neck against the terrifying, smoke-belching steam machine. This was John Henry, the ultimate steel-driving man, and he was about to prove that human spirit could never be crushed by cold iron. During the peak of the Industrial Revolution, the railroads were expanding across the American frontier, chewing through mountains to lay down tracks. John Henry was the strongest worker on the line. With a 10-pound hammer in each hand, he could tunnel through solid bedrock faster than any crew. But one day, the railroad bosses brought in a new invention, a steam-powered drilling machine. They claimed it could outdig any man, meaning thousands of hard-working pioneers were about to lose their livelihoods. John Henry wasn't going to let that happen. He stepped up to the massive brass and iron monstrosity and made a bet. He would race the steam drill, man against machine. Whoever could drive their drill deepest into the mountain in one day would win. The whistle blew and the mountain shook. The steam engine roared, chewing into the rock with relentless mechanical fury. But John Henry swung his hammers with a rhythm that sounded like thunder. The heat in the tunnel became unbearable, the dust blinding, but John refused to stop. For hours, the ringing of his hammers echoed against the screeching metal of the machine. As the sun set, the steam drill groaned, sputtered, and finally broke down, completely overwhelmed by the solid stone. John Henry had driven his steel a full 14 feet, beating the machine's 9. He proved that no machine could ever match the heart of a man. He won the race, but the effort was too much. He collapsed with his hammer still in his hand, passing away into absolute legend. Every region has its own unsung heroes and unbelievable legends. Who's the greatest mythological figure from your hometown? Drop their story in the comments below.
Pecos Bill was known as the greatest cowboy in Texas, a man who could ride a cyclone and lasso a tornado. But even Bill was left speechless the day he met Slue-Foot Sue. The cowboys of the frontier were gathered along the muddy banks of the Rio Grande, sweating in the brutal summer heat, when the water suddenly began to violently churn. Surging up from the depths was a monstrous whiskered catfish the size of a river steamboat, thrashing wildly against the current. But the real shock wasn't the giant fish. Standing perfectly balanced on the slick, scaly back of the river monster was a fiery, red-headed cowgirl named Slue-Foot Sue. While a dozen tough frontiersmen watched with their jaws on the dirt, Sue was casually using a thick braided rope to steer the beast like a champion rodeo bronco. The massive catfish breached the surface, sending a tidal wave of muddy water crashing over the riverbanks, but Sue just laughed, tipping her wide-brimmed hat to the stunned crowd. Pecos Bill instantly fell head over heels in love. He knew right then and there that he had finally found the only woman in the entire Wild West who was tough enough to keep up with him. The rivers and deserts of the frontier are full of legendary, untamed characters. Who is the wildest, most fearless figure from your local folklore? Share their unbelievable story with us down in the comments.
The Mississippi River in the early 1800s was a wild, untamed beast of muddy water, treacherous currents, and deadly snags. But there was one man who claimed he was meaner than the river itself, Mike Fink, the self-proclaimed king of the keelboaters. Mike wasn't just a riverboat captain. He was a walking, talking force of nature. He boasted to anyone who would listen that he was half horse, half alligator, and topped off with a touch of snapping turtle. He wore a bright red feather in his hat to challenge any man on the frontier to a fight, and according to legend, nobody ever managed to knock it off. One sweltering summer afternoon, Mike and his crew were poling their heavy keelboat upstream against a brutal, relentless current. The heat was absolutely unbearable, and the men were exhausted, their hands blistered from the heavy wooden poles.
Suddenly, the boat slammed into something incredibly solid, grinding to a violent halt in the shallow, muddy waters. It wasn't a sunken log or a hidden sandbar. Rising from the murky depths was an absolutely monstrous alligator, easily 30 feet long, with scales as thick as iron armor and teeth like jagged hunting knives. The beast hissed, snapping its massive jaws and threatening to tear the wooden boat to splinters. The crew panicked, scrambling over crates and barrels to get away from the edge of the boat. A young, terrified greenhorn deckhand practically fainted, screaming that they were all doomed to be river food. But Mike Fink didn't panic. He just threw back his head and let out a booming laugh that echoed off the distant riverbanks. He didn't even bother grabbing his famous long rifle. Instead, he stripped off his heavy leather shirt, flexed his massive muscles, and dove headfirst right off the bow of the boat, splashing down directly on top of the giant alligator's scaly back. What followed was the most spectacular wrestling match the Mississippi River had ever seen. The muddy water churned into a blinding white froth as Mike and the giant alligator rolled over and over, fighting tooth and nail. Mike locked his thick arms around the beast's neck, refusing to let go, even as the gator thrashed its heavy tail, sending geysers of water high into the air. After a full hour of relentless, exhausting grappling, the giant alligator finally realized it had met its match. It let out a defeated groan, surrendered to the king of the keelboaters, and allowed Mike to put a thick rope harness around its neck. From that day on, whenever the wind died down and the men were tired, Mike Fink just had his tamed river monster tow his keelboat all the way up to St. Louis. The rivers and dark waters of the country are full of unbelievable mysteries. What is the most famous legend or bizarre myth connected to the rivers or lakes in your home state? Tell us the story down in the comments.
Coyote was trotting across the high, wind-swept desert on a morning so bitter that the air felt like needles of ice pressing against his skin. He was lucky enough to be wearing a magnificent, thick woolen blanket woven with vibrant red and blue patterns that kept the biting winter wind at bay. As he climbed a jagged ridge, he came across a massive, smooth black boulder that had sat in that same spot since the dawn of time. Feeling unusually generous and wanting to impress the spirits of the land, Coyote decided to show his respect. He took off his beautiful blanket and draped it over the cold stone, telling the rock it could keep the gift to stay warm for the rest of eternity. But by the time the sun began to dip behind the distant purple mountains, the temperature plummeted even further. Coyote started to shiver uncontrollably, his teeth chattering so loud they sounded like dry sticks snapping in the dark. He quickly began to regret his impulsive gift. He ran back up the ridge, snatched the heavy blanket off the boulder, and wrapped it tightly around his own shoulders, laughing to himself about how silly it was to think a stone needed to stay warm. He hadn't even walked 50 paces back toward his den when a deep, rhythmic, thudding vibration began to shake the ground beneath his paws. He turned around to find that the massive boulder had come to life. Fueled by a quiet, ancient anger, the rock was rolling down the ridge with terrifying, gathering speed. Coyote bolted across the salt flats, his heart hammering against his ribs, but the rock was relentless. It smashed through thickets of sagebrush and flattened entire groves of ancient pine trees as it roared after him like a silent, heavy beast. Coyote spotted a tiny desert mouse peeking from its burrow and screamed for the little creature to trip the rock, but the mouse just dove deeper into the safety of the earth as the stone thundered past. Even a massive grizzly bear foraging for late-season berries had to leap for its life, standing on its hind legs and looking on in total confusion as a panicked, blanket-clad coyote was chased by a screaming, rolling mountain of granite. Coyote realized in that moment that you can't just take back a gift once it's been given to the earth. He would have to use every ounce of his trickster wit just to survive the night. The American frontier is a place where even the stones have a memory. What's the strangest myth about the natural landmarks in your part of the country? Tell us the story in the comments.
Before the stars ever painted the night sky, the entire world was drowned in absolute freezing darkness. The only light in the universe was fiercely hoarded by a greedy, powerful chief who lived in a massive cedar lodge at the edge of the world. He kept the sun, the moon, and the stars locked away inside a series of intricately carved, heavy wooden boxes, heavily guarded by two fierce wolf warriors who never slept. The chief loved the dark because it meant no one could see the vast treasures he had stolen from the surrounding tribes. But Raven, the ultimate shape-shifting trickster, was tired of stumbling around in the pitch black. He formulated a brilliant, daring plan to steal the light back for the world. Knowing he couldn't fight the heavily armed wolf warriors, Raven transformed himself into an incredibly wealthy, ancient traveling merchant wearing a cloak of shimmering, iridescent feathers. He approached the chief's lodge, promising rare and unimaginable treasures from across the sea in exchange for just a single glimpse of the chief's fabled glowing boxes. The greedy chief, blinded by his own lust for wealth, ordered his guards to stand down and invited the disguised trickster inside. As the chief proudly opened the final innermost box, a blinding, magnificent golden light spilled out, illuminating the dark cedar walls. In a fraction of a second, Raven dropped his disguise. He shifted back into his true form, a massive, sleek black bird. With a triumphant caw that echoed like thunder, he snatched the glowing orb of the sun in his sharp beak. The chief screamed in fury, and the wolf warriors lunged, their jaws snapping inches from Raven's tail feathers. But the trickster was too fast. He blasted through the smoke hole in the roof of the lodge, soaring high into the freezing, empty sky. As the furious chief watched from the ground, Raven tossed the sun high into the heavens, breaking the eternal night forever. He then scattered the remaining glowing fragments across the dark expanse, creating the moon and the stars. The Pacific Northwest is filled with ancient magic and shape-shifting legends. What is the oldest mythological story passed down in your family or region? Share your legendary tale with us in the comments.